Welcome, everybody, to the NFL Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. The NFL Show is brought to you by Replenishing Care and Technologies. Make sure you check them out at rcandt.com. I am your co-host for the NFL Show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, Sam Teets. How you doing, Sam?
Doing great, Mike. How about you?
All right, and today we're going to finish it off with the 1940s, the top 10 players of the 1940s, and then over the next, 8 days or so, we're going to break down each division, give you predictions for the coming football season. So today, 1940s, and before anybody has to be a wise ass and tell us we weren't alive then, we weren't. But I've seen a ton of film on this, probably as much as anybody. So I'm ready to go on it, Sam. How about you?
Yeah, I'm ready to go too. I spent actually a lot of time looking this up the other day. I wanted to come prepared. I didn't want to get picked apart like I did the last time we did this.
I would never pick you apart, Sam.
Yeah, it only happens every other show, Mike.
Well, I mean, it's your own damn fault, Sam.
Yeah, I can't argue with that sometimes.
All right, we'll start off with number 10. I'll start it off. We're going to go with Bob Waterfield. His pro career was 1945 to 52. He made the NFL Hall of Fame in 1965. He was the future choice of the 1944 draft, made an immediate impact as a pro in 1945. Not only was he the NFL's most valuable player as a rookie in 1945, but he led the team to an NFL championship. The victory was keyed by 2 touchdown passes from Waterfield. The next year, the Rams moved to L.A., and Waterfield continued his elite play. He won All-Pro honors 3 times and led the league in passing twice. His career marks included 11,849 yards, 97 touchdowns passing, 573 points on 13 touchdowns, 315 point-after attempts, 60 field goals, and a 42.4-yard punting average. So the one thing we do see with the quarterbacks here, a lot of them were more than just quarterbacks in the 1940s, Sam.
Well, it's not just the quarterbacks. I think it's a little bit of everyone. I've got guys on my list who played offensive line and then played linebacker on the other side. So there are guys who, in the 40s, we're seeing the dual players who play both sides of the ball consistently.
All right, who do you got at number 10?
Number 10, I have Max Speedy. He's the first one of a bunch of Browns I have on my list. He played 3 years in the 50s, so his entire career wasn't in the 40s, but during his 4 seasons in the 1940s, he led the NFL in receiving yards twice and receptions. Well, he wasn't in the NFL the entire time. He was in the AAFC for a little while, but he led everyone in receptions 3 times, receiving yards twice. So he was a very good player. I don't think he was a generational type receiver in a sense, but he was a guy who I think is good enough to fit at the bottom of this list. There's a lot more high-quality players higher up, I think, but at the same point, I think Speedy is a good number 10.
Well, the thing about Speedy is, he played college football at Utah, but he was discovered by the legendary Paul Brown while playing service ball during World War II, because Brown actually, who had coached at Ohio State, became the coach at the Great Lakes Naval Academy. And, I mean, the thing about him is he surpassed the 1,000-yard receiving mark in 2 of his first 4 seasons, which was a huge accomplishment back then. And I think he had over 200 receptions during his career, and he led the league in receptions with 62 in his final season. That was 1952. I don't have him there, of course, because he played in the AAFC for the majority of the 1940s. I think the Browns joined the NFL in 1950, maybe 51. So that's why he's not on my list. Plus, I think there's a lot of guys here that were a lot better than that, Sam. But I'm trying not to pick your list apart, so I'm going to be quiet now. What do you got at number 9?
Well, number 9 is the guy you just mentioned. It's Bob Waterfield. I think he could have been high on this list, but I've got I think 3 quarterbacks ahead of him on this list. So he's not going to be any higher than 9 just because I think there were better quarterbacks during his era. There really were. Bob Warfield is a Hall of Famer. He's got the MVP award for, I think, 1945, his rookie season. But at the same point, he just doesn't compete necessarily with some of the guys proceeding towards the top 5 in terms of quarterbacks from the 1940s.
All right, my number 9 is Marion Motley. And I know that he played for the Browns, mainly AAFC in the 40s, but he was a great running back. And he was one of 4 players to permanently break professional football's color barrier in 1946, the year before Jackie Robinson in Major League Baseball, because in the 1920s, African Americans could play in the NFL until George Preston Marshall became the owner of the Washington Redskins and kind of turned everybody against that. But he was a devastating pass blocker, perhaps the best of his era, and a fearless runner. And the Browns had the famous trap play that Motley just destroyed people on. He was also an exceptional linebacker early in his career and is the all-time AAFC rushing leader and led the NFL in rushing in 1950. His career numbers read 828 carries for 4,720 yards, 85 receptions, 234 points. So my number 9 is Cleveland Browns' Marion Motley. You got him higher?
I got him one spot higher. I'm number 8. I had to have him on the list.
Well, go ahead, and we'll go to your number 8 then, because it seems like it'll fit perfectly.
Yeah, no, I had to have him on my list. I think it's funny because he's listed on ProFootballReference.com, which is the site I use to get all the stats. He's listed at the same weight as Jim Brown. And we talked about how Jim Brown was such a dominant running back, so he's just so physically well built later on. But Marion Motley was the same weight, and that came much earlier than Jim Brown. So, it's like I said, a physically dominant running back. He was a great blocker as well. People sometimes overlook that. And this was a guy who got fouled by Paul Brown when he played for the Great Lakes Naval Blue Jackets. You mentioned that earlier. So he actually got found by Paul Brown. He tried out, and they didn't expect him necessarily to make the team originally. At least Marion Motley didn't think he would. But then he did make the team, and he became I don't know if he said, like, what would you rate him? Was he a superstar running back, or was he kind of like a guy who was really good and kind of one of the lower-level Hall of Famers, or was he a generational-type talent? I had trouble.
Are you talking about Motley?
Yeah, Motley.
I think Motley was a generational type talent. I think he was an all-time great. I mean, the problem with the 1940s is with World War II, most of these guys' careers really are from 1944, 45 to 19 whatever. And because you had that few years with the war, and the better players were actually fighting in World War II overseas.
Yeah, no, I got a couple of guys marked down here on the list who missed some playing time because they were fighting during World War II. So it's certainly something that impacted that era. But I think, like I said, Motley was physically just on another level for most guys we're going to have on this list.
All right, where are we at? My number 8, I'm going to go Charlie Trippi, who was out of the University of Georgia, played for the Chicago Cardinals. Trippi was the Cardinals' number 1 future draft pick in the 1945 draft. The future draft picks were because of the war, and a lot of guys weren't available to play. They had to wait almost 2 years for him to play, and he was worth the wait. Trippi actually signed a $100,000 contract with the team and instantly contributed. He was the final link in the Cards' famed dream backfield and led the Chicago Cardinals to their only NFL championship in 1947 as he scored 2 TDs. He was extremely versatile. He played halfback, I think, 5 years out of that, quarterback for 2 years, and then defense for another 2 years. So this was a guy, as we talked about before, that could do a little bit of everything. But my number 8 is Charlie Trippi. What do you got at number 7, Sam?
Yeah, my number 7 is Bill Dudley. And this is one of the few standout players who played for Pittsburgh before really we get to the Chuck Noll era. But him and Erlen Stottner basically were 2 of the guys who I know back then who were really great. John Henry Johnson was there too for a little while. But Bill Dudley's my guy at number, 7? Because during 2 of his first 3 seasons, he leads the league in rushing yards. Total, he's in first-team All-Pro as a rookie. In 1946, he wins the MVP award. That's a couple years into his career. It's his final season in Pittsburgh. And did have 2 productive years also in the 50s with Washington at the time. But to me, early in his career was probably the best years, and he did miss significant time because he played in 42. But then, like you said, he spent time in the war. So he missed 43 and 44 before returning for a little bit of 45.
All right, I've actually got him slightly higher on the list. My number 7 is Tony Canadio, who was from Gonzaga. He was probably the guy most famous before John Stockton. And Canadio was a versatile halfback for the Green Bay Packers. He arrived in 1941. He served mainly as an understudy to the veteran Cecil Isbell, who was a veteran quarterback. That changed in 1943 when he became the Packers' number 1 passer. His performance that year earned him all NFL honors. After military service, he resumed his football career as a heavy-duty running back. In 1949, he became only the 3rd player in NFL history and the first ever Green Bay Packer to rush for 1,000 yards in a season. So my number 7 is Tony Canadio. And the thing about him, he is one of 5 Packers to have their number retired by the Story franchise. And, I mean, he's up there with Don Hudson, guys like that. So that's my number 7. What do you have at number 6?
My number 6, and I'm betting this is someone who isn't on your list, or maybe someone who's a little bit higher. But my number 6 is actually Arnold Graham. People forget that he played for 4 or 5 years in the 40s. And he was such a dominant player. Of course, he's playing the AAFC, so we have to put that out there. But late in the 40s, he was the first-team All-Pro 3 times. He led the AAFC in passing yards 3 times. A very good player. And during the 40s, He amassed over 10,000 passing yards for 86 touchdowns in just 54 games. So Arnold Graham was, when we mentioned he was the top player on our list for the 1950s, I believe, for both of us. But he did have those dominant years in the 40s. To me, that's good enough to get into the top 10 for this list.
I gave him number 1 on the other one, so I was going with other people on this one. My number 6 is George Mcafee. Mcafee was a phenomenal two-way star who was a long-distance threat whenever he touched the ball. He took the league by storm when he returned a punt for a TD to give the Bears a last-second victory in his very first game. And although his Navy service came at the peak of his career, which is 41 through 44, I mean, he still managed to score 234 points. He gained 5,313 combined net yards. He intercepted 25 passes in 8 seasons. His career punt return average of 12.78, I think, is still an NFL record to this day. And the thing is, this guy might have been in the top 3 if 1942, 43, and 44, at the height of his career, he was in the NFL. But he was fighting in the war. So I mean, this is a guy that could have been a lot higher, and I think he's a guy that is forgotten when you talk about two-way stars.
Well, we could have had, I think, a couple of guys in here be legends in terms of being even greater than they are currently if they had played it, because he left the NFL at the age of 23. So he played 41 to 23 years old. He comes back, he's 27. So you miss a lot of prime years there. And when you're out of football for that long, it does impact your level of play. So I think if he had stuck around, if he'd been able to play out his entirety of his career, just going straight through it, I think it would have been an entirely different situation.
Well, and really, that was the case in all sports in the 1940s because of World War II. You had guys like Joe Louis, who just fought exhibitions for most of the time when he was in the military. A guy like Ted Williams, who in the prime of his career, I think 1941 is when he batted .406, and then he has to go into the military. So a lot of things were changed by World War II, not just, historically, but also in the sports world, and maybe some records that may have been broke that weren't.
Yeah, it certainly had a major impact. We haven't really seen that recently, though, with professional sports. Since then, it's kind of become a situation where we haven't had to send professional athletes overseas to fight in war. So some have volunteered to go over for us. Well,
the thing is this. It has been basically since Vietnam, there hasn't been a draft. And the only way that these guys were going if there was a draft. And, if you look back even at the Packers with Jim Taylor and Paul Hornung in the early 60s, having to get them out, for the 62 championship game or one of those games, just having to get them on leave so they could have them play in the game. My number 5 is the Pittsburgh Steeler, Bill Dudley. He was Virginia's first All-American selection in 1941. He became a Steeler in 1942. He was small in size, but he was exceptionally versatile and awesomely efficient in his play. In 1946, he won a rare triple crown when he led the NFL in rushing, interceptions, and punt returns. He was the NFL's most valuable player in 1946, and he gained a combined over 2,000 net yards, scored almost 500 points, and had 23 interceptions during his career. Another guy, if you give him 1943 and 44, it might even been bigger. But I think it's hard not to have a guy in the top 5 that leads the NFL in rushing, interceptions, and punt returns and wins the MVP in 1946.
I said there's just a lot of quarterbacks. So I had him a little bit lower because I said there's a bunch of quarterbacks I have up here. And a lot of those guys are two-way players. It's not just him. A bunch of these guys that we have up here were two-way guys who are tremendous at multiple positions.
All right. Who do you got at number 5, Sam?
Yeah, so my number 5 is Clyde Bulldog Turner. He played offensive line. Oh, yeah, I got him there too? All right. Yeah. I'll be honest. I didn't know who this guy was until last night when I looked him up. But
come on,
Sam.
He
deserves it, though. He deserves a great spot here because offensive lineman, linebacker, he led the league in interceptions in 1942, even though he's more known for playing on the interior offensive line. And, he amassed them. He had a really good career. He had a lot of championships. He had 4 NFL championships. He was a 7-time first-team All-Pro. I can't believe I never heard of this guy before.
Me neither, since he's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame since 2 years before I was even born. But, he was an immediate starter in 1940. He was one of the most athletic members of the team. He was a terrific blocker, superb pass defender, and a flawless long snapper. And during his career, he was selected during the decade of the 40s to 7 all NFL teams. We're not talking Pro Bowl. Once again, we're talking all NFL. And as a center, he anchored one of the great offensive lines in NFL history with the Chicago Bears. And during that decade, they won 4 NFL championships. And I don't think it's any surprise that was the one decade where they won 4 championships. They actually had a legitimate quarterback in Sid Luckman.
Yeah, speaking of Sid Luckman, you want to transition to my number 4. That's who I have at 4. I got Sid Luckman there. The really only great Bears quarterback I think we've seen since the 40s at the very least. They haven't had another player who's been at his level or has dominated the way he did. During the 40s, Luckman had almost 14,000 passing yards, 131 touchdowns. They won the 4 NFL championships, of course, which you just mentioned. A 5-time All-NFL player. And in 1943, he won the Joe F. Card MVP award. So this is a guy who was one of the best quarterbacks of that era. And really, him along with Sammy Ball, who we're going to talk about later, guys who really transitioned the quarterback position, is something that I wasn't at the time.
Yeah, I've actually got – where do you have Luckman 4? I've got him at number 3. And he was the Bears' number 1 choice in 1939. And he became the first great professional T formation quarterback, which they were the first team to use the T formation. Notre Dame and some other colleges had used it. But he led the team to a 73-0 demolishing, and it was an upset of the Washington Redskins in the 1940 NFL championship. And then after that, there was a mad rush of teams to convert to that offensive system where the ball gets thrown a lot more. He was a great signal caller and ball handler, and he was an all-NFL selection 5 times in the decade. As you said, the NFL MVP in 1943. His career numbers include almost 15,000 yards passing and 137 touchdowns. You figured that's 137 touchdowns doesn't sound a lot, but at a time where the ball wasn't really thrown a lot, I mean, that's right around a touchdown pass a game, which is really unheard of back then, except for from Sammy Ball, who I think we're both going to talk about here in a little bit. So what does that bring us to? Your number 3 or your number 2?
My number 3. My number 3 is Steve Van Buren. I think you can make the argument he's definitely top 3. He has to be top 3 in my opinion, but you can make the argument he's number 1 or number 2 on this list. He was a halfback for the Philadelphia Eagles, arguably the best in their franchise's history. He led the league in rushing yards 4 total times, all during the 1940s. He's just a dominant player. I mean, he really dominated the league. Probably one of the best running backs of his era. Like I said, the 4 rushing titles, 2-time NFL champion, and a 5-time All-League player. Steve Van Buren, to me, is probably the best running back I saw from the number-wise from this decade.
Yeah, I've got him at number 2. I think he was by far one of the greatest runners in NFL history and easily the greatest running back in Philadelphia Eagles history. He was the number 1 pick in the 1944 draft. He was an all-NFL selection 6 straight years. It provided the Eagles with one of the league's most potent running games. 4 times he won the NFL's rushing crown. He topped that off with a punt return title in 1944 and a kickoff return title in 1945. His career numbers were almost 6,000 yards rushing, 464 points scored. He is the first player to rush for 1,000 yards more than once, and he helped the Eagles win an NFL World Championship. So Steve Van Buren, if you watched the movie Invincible, Sam, that's how you knew who he was, right?
Absolutely. Me and movies, that just goes hand in hand based on everything we've talked about in this show.
Well, yeah, haven't you seen Invincible?
No.
Oh, geez, Sam. That movie came out like within the last decade.
It did?
Yeah. About Vince Papale?
Okay, that was 2006. All right, you got to listen, I don't remember much between 2004 and 2005. That's when I still really start remembering things. So.
Is that where you were heavy into the weed?
I'm not heavy into the weed.
No, back then you were, though, right? When you were like 2 or 3 years old?
Oh, yeah. That's why my lists are so messed up, Mike.
That would explain it. What do you got at number 2?
Number 2, I think this is going to surprise you because I actually forgot that he played a lot in the 40s, but it's Don Hudson. And I think we talked about this when we ranked the top 10 receivers of all time. He was, top 3. I think he was number 2 for both of us, I'm pretty sure. But he had 4 receiving titles in the decade, 1944 NFL champion, 6 all-league selections, and he won the MVP award in 1941 and 1942. I think he gets overlooked because people view him a little bit more as a 30s player. But at the same point, I think his career is fairly evenly split between the 30s and 40s, so I'm going to put him at number 2.
All right, I can see that. I would have him number 1 at the 30s. I didn't have him on the 40s, but I would assume then both of our number 1s is Sammy Ball.
Yeah, it has to be, right?
And Ball was a 2-time All-American at TCU. He was Washington's number 1 draft pick in 1937. He is noted as the league's first big yardage passer and spurred an offensive revolution in the NFL. He was in all NFL selections 7 times in the decade. He captured a rare triple crown in 1943, when he led the NFL in passing, punting, and interceptions. And he led the NFL in passing 6 times, registered a total of almost 22,000 yards, 187 passing touchdowns. And what's more amazing to me is he intercepted 31 passes as a defensive halfback. And on top of that, even more amazing, he had a 45.1-yard punting average. And you got to remember, the ball through a lot of his career was a little harder to kick than it would be nowadays, just the way it was shaped. So Sammy Ball's a guy that when you do a top 10 list of players of all time, he has to be on that list.
Yeah, he did a little bit of everything. We talked about other guys who were versatile, but I don't think anyone was really on this list as versatile as Sammy Ball. You mentioned the interceptions, the punting, being able to throw the way he did, which was unheard of at the time. It's just a great combination. I don't think we've seen anyone like that. No one saw anyone like him at the time. And then I don't think maybe we've seen 1 or 2 guys compete with him since then, but no one really quite likes Sammy Ball.
I don't think we have. I mean, you got Danny White. I mean, he wasn't intercepting passes.
Yeah, there's really nowhere, like I said, there's not many guys who can go out there exceeding 3 fastest at the game the way he did.
Now, there is one guy I wanted to bring up on here, and that was Byron Whizzer White. And he was a Pittsburgh Steeler in 1938, Detroit Lion in 40 and 41. And he was a Heisman Trophy winner, runner-up, consensus All-American in 1937. He was extremely intelligent. White was a Phi Beta Kappa and had just received a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University in England. He was convinced by Pittsburgh Pirates owner Art Rooney, however, to delay his education to play football. It paid off. White led the NFL in rushing as a rookie. And after his studies, he returned with the Detroit Lions after doing the Rhodes Scholar in Oxford. Played for the Lions for 2 seasons, and then he served in World War II, and that was pretty much it. But Byron Whizzer White's a guy that I think could have possibly been number 1 or 2 or 3 on this list if he would have actually concentrated and played football in the 1940s.
Like you mentioned, he led the league in rushing. He played 3 years and led the league in rushing yards in 2 of them. So he was still in his 20s too. He left when he was 24, 25 years old. That was his final season. So if he had played into his mid to late 20s, I think you could have seen a guy who would have been a Hall of Famer. If you had any kind of potential like that, you really only need 5 or 6 or 7 other reasonable seasons to actually go out and make the Hall of Fame at that level.
Yeah, and you also got to bring up that he did end up being for 31 years, from 1962 to 1993, an associate justice on the United States Supreme Court. So I think that what he did was probably the right thing.
Yeah, it seems to have worked out pretty well for him.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't work out too bad. He ended up being a Supreme Court justice. All right, Sam, what division are we starting with tomorrow?
Let's pick a fun one. What about the AFC West? I think that's going to be a competitive one.
All right, tomorrow at 1, me and Sam will be back, maybe with a special guest, to preview the AFC West. We'll give you predictions on each team, how their season will go, who makes the playoffs out of it. And we will go AFC West tomorrow on Wednesday. On Thursday, where are we going? You want to just go NFC West? We'll just kind of bounce back and forth?
Yeah, might as well.
All right, and then, of course, we'll have to do the AFC North by Friday at the latest.
Yeah.
So
make sure we get that.
We're gonna win it. All right, you can follow Sam at SamTeets33. He's also a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, so you may want to say a prayer for him tonight to get religion and become a Bengals fan before it's too late. You can follow me at Grueling Truth. You can hear all of our shows on iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify. Wherever you find podcasts, you'll find us. Also, I want to remind you to follow and check out Replenishing Care Technologies, rcandt.com. So for now, for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.